thought, Russell, this film were to be looked at by our descendants, like a Dead Sea Scroll in 1,000 years' time, what would you think it's worth telling that generation?
Mind spins in spirals like the card Cogito. I think, therefore, but do I even know? Hume said the sun might not rise in the morning. Patterns ain't proof, just habits we adorn. Russell's teapot floating out in the void. Invisible doubts that can't be destroyed. Belief ain't a bird and the skeptic employs. Question the noise, the cosmos ploys. Skeptic's eyes always peeping the fraud. Truth ain't handed down, it's wrestled from the gods. Doubts my temple, my faith is flawed. Think it through twice before I applaud. Induction wobbles like a table with no leg. Hume's knife cuts leave certainty begging. A billion white swans, but black renegade. Shatter the mirror, the cracks cascade. Cogito feels strong, but is it really? Thoughts build castles, clouds act silly. Russell's pot spins in the ether so freely. Prove it exists or the claim's too dreamy. Am I the dreamer or the dream in the show? The car wrestled devils, still didn't know. Faith and senses, they play tricks on a low. Truth's a mirage in a desert of woe.
When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out. Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think could have beneficent social effects if it were believed. But look only and solely at what are the facts.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Skeptic Philosophy. As always, I am your host, Robert. Today, we have a special guest on that I have been waiting to talk to. I wish I had a few minutes to talk to him before we got started, but unfortunately, he came in pretty hot here just at the very last minute. But we're going to have Leophilius on here. Today, we're fixing to be talking about the subject of the PSR and the first calls. So without any further ado, we're going to bring Leo on up here. Leo, how's it going, man?
It's going well. How are you doing?
Fantastic, man. It's good to talk to you. I've been watching you do some different debates. I've seen a few of your YouTube videos. I've seen you did some with the Bread of Life lady and another gentleman. These are some older ones, but I've seen you've been fairly active over there on Mega Bloodbath. I don't know that you've been doing a ton on your channel as of late. Have you been working on any particular projects?
No, I need to purchase this editing software that I spent an hour learning, and then because they have a free version of it. And then I spent an hour learning it, went to and edited and was going to upload a video to find out that with the free version, you can't upload videos longer than 60 seconds. So I just need to purchase that. And then once I have that, I'll be able to pull some of the debates that I've had other places and clip them up as I need to and post those and then start doing posted content. But I usually do a live stream every now and then. It just depends on the frequency with which I come across videos that I feel that I want to respond to. I've done a little bit more these past few weeks in trying to look for those kinds of videos. So there's a couple out by Jay Dyer that I might do a stream responding to here in the future. So
fantastic. Yeah, I've seen some of the videos that you did. You did a collection at one time on bad science, which looked like a pretty decent collection of videos. There are some subjects that needed to be tackled for sure.
That's one I'd like to get back into doing, the bad science communication one.
Yep.
I just haven't spent a lot of time really looking for things where I feel some sort of concept in science is not communicated properly. But I'm waiting for an article or something to come out about Hawking radiation, because that's another one that – have I already done one on that? I don't think so. That's one that's definitely something that's misunderstood. And the way that it's commonly described to people by physicists is not actually, in my opinion, and the opinion of many other physicists, is not an appropriate way of describing how it occurs.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever tackled this subject of the double split, but obviously that's probably, in my opinion, one of the most misunderstood components that there are. I think there's these misnomers that the act of seeing rather than the act of instrumentation is causing an effect on it. So that's one of the biggest misnomers that I could think of off the top of my head. Mm-hmm. That being said, though, let's jump into the subject. You picked PSR and first calls. Where do you want to start?
I mean, it's really just kind of wherever you want to start. We could start with the traditional Kalam style argument and why those don't work. We could start with more of a contingency argument and why I don't find those to be convincing arguments. So,
well, let's start. I actually did a 15 question thing. I didn't know whenever I do these little things, I don't know like how much kind of a static thing that people put together, or if they just want to have more of a Q&A kind of thing. So I always do a Q&A thing. So I have a few questions that are put up here that are a few things that I'd like to get ticked off in the conversation, at least that we have spoke about. What are the main scientific models that attempt to explain the origin of the universe today? And how do they differ from traditional Big Bang pictures? And I had on here, for example, inflation cosmology, cyclical models, and quantum creation models.
Yeah, so inflation, at least as of right now, is something that most cosmologists are going to accept. They're going to say that an inflation or an inflation-like event most likely occurred very, very early in the universe's evolutionary history. There are attempts by some cosmologists to extend inflation indefinitely into the past. There are some issues with doing that. Most people are probably familiar with the Bordet-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Whether that theorem can be bypassed or not is debated, not strongly, but debated amongst cosmologists. Most of them think that the theorem doesn't apply when you start looking at the quantum regime, because if you read the paper, it is strictly in both the classical and I think the semi-classical limit. So it is generally considered a classical theorem. But there's also an alternative to inflation that was developed by Neil Turok and Paul Steinhardt, if I remember correctly, called ekpyrotic cosmology. And it's been a while since I've read anything on that, so I couldn't really explicate what that is specifically, but it is an attempt to replace inflation. And I do believe that the universe is eternal in some sense in that model. And then there are cyclic models. Roger Penrose's conformal cyclic cosmology is probably one of the more popular ones. It does not work. Cosmologists will say it does not work. That does not mean that it isn't interesting as an idea. There are other sort of ways that people might try to make the universe cyclic. I don't really hold the cyclic models myself. And then there are what are called quantum nucleation models. I think Lawrence Krauss posits something like that. Alexander Vilenkin, I think, posits something like that the universe sort of nucleated out of some sort of quantum mechanical event or quantum mechanical state. And then that just happens stochastically. These are all going to differ from the traditional Big Bang model in that the traditional Big Bang model does not actually tell us anything about the origin of the universe. It tells us that very early in its evolutionary history, it was in an extremely hot and extremely dense state, and it has since evolved from that state into the universe that we see today. And a point that many who know me are going to know that I like to make frequently, and I think it's an important point to make. And I think that when us as atheists engage with theists, or I should say skeptics or non-theists more broadly, because not all of us may be strictly atheists, but as skeptics or as non-theists, when we engage with the theists and the believers on this subject, I think it should be pointed out. If you're ever asked, well, what came before the Big Bang, you should say inflation, because technically inflation did come before the Big Bang. What cosmologists, and maybe this is somewhat technical, but I still think it's a point worth making. When cosmologists talk about the hot Big Bang phase of the universe's evolution, they're referring to what's known as thermalization or reheating, which occurs immediately following the inflationary epoch. Now, the reason that it's called the reheating period is because given that inflation was an exponential expansion of space, what's going to happen is the density is going to drop drastically, and therefore temperature is going to drop drastically. Now, granted, temperature goes from about 10 to the 32nd Kelvin down to, I think it's like 10 to the 26 Kelvin, which is still so hot that a human couldn't comprehend it, but that's still orders of magnitude cooler than what it started as. And so despite the fact that the temperature goes from super hot to still being super hot, it did drop by orders of magnitude and is thus referred to as a supercooling event. Now, when inflation stops, naturally everything's going to start to heat back up. That is the Big Bang. That event and what occurs as a result of that event, and there's a variety of stages there's like about 5 separate stages within what we call the Big Bang, periods of evolution. That is called the reheating epoch, and that is why it is referred to as reheating, because it comes after inflation, which was a supercooling event.
Okay, so we start with a super hot, dense state, obviously, enormously hot. Then we have a rapid expansion and cooling while that expansion is happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm curious because I saw this. I was reading about I guess it was protons and let me find this. The swinger mechanism, sometimes called the swinger effect. It seems to start with a strong electromagnetic field or an electrofield, and then this electric field winds up pulling these positrons and electrons out of basically the vacuum of the quantum field, right? And it seems like you have an electric field that starts, and there's this field, the quantum field, that I don't know your position on the quantum field, whether the quantum field, do you think the quantum field was before the Big Bang, or do you think that's something that came to be before?
Yes.
After? What?
So a lot of people will say the quantum field, but I think that it's important to point out that there are a number of quantum fields. There's a quantum field for not every individual particle, but every individual class of particles. So all electrons are just resonant perturbations in the electron field. All up quarks are just resonant perturbations in the up quark field. All neutrinos are just resonant perturbations in the neutrino field. And then there are 3 different classes of neutrinos. I'm actually not sure whether the 3 different flavors of neutrinos are 3 different fields, because the neutrinos can oscillate between their flavors or types. There's the electron neutrino, the mu neutrino, and the tau neutrino, and they can spontaneously change from one to the other. I do think that there are 3 separate fields there, though, but don't quote me on that. So there are a multitude of quantum fields. I don't know if I can say whether all of them existed prior to the Big Bang. I can say that there was at least one quantum field, and that would have been what's known as the inflaton field, or the quantum field that was responsible for inflation as it decayed it effectively into the quantum fields that we know and love today.
So in the quantum field, if we remove everything that we think of as matter, that is a touchable, contactable thing, we could remove everything out of the void of space and have what we would call effectively empty space by really any metric of physicality. It's empty space, but we still have a quantum field that has some form of fluctuation that is going on there. And what can be purged out of that is if we have any type of electric field or electric charge that goes into that, it seems to be pulling out these positively charged and electrically charged. I think for the most part, the only one that we've been able to make it bring out is the electrons and the neutrons, right?
Electron-positron pairs, yeah.
Electron-positron pairs, okay. Which is different than like the quarks, because we've been able to make quarks duplicate, but only in the Hadron Collider, right? So when those collide and when we hit those high pressures, they split apart for a very short instance. And it seems, correct me if I'm wrong, that the energy from this impact seems to be getting absorbed into and creating other quarks that then immediately have to be pulled to, you have up quarks and down quarks. And this is kind of the foundation blocks of atoms. So when we slam these together, we'll get the quarks will break apart just for a very small instance. And I understand that the measurement of the heat on that is so true. It's hotter than the sun.
It's how we know about what occurred at the very early universe, because we're recreating for, trillionths of a second, we're recreating the temperatures that existed at those very, very early moments.
What I seen is the Kern one did 5.5 trillion Kelvin is what they measured off of that one with them slamming, which is, if y'all don't understand the temperatures we're talking about here, the core of the sun, we're talking about the core of the sun is in the
core of the sun millions of times over.
Right. It's enormously hot. But it seems like that there's some kind of plasma bond that is happening between the quarks that they want to, and this is why you can't find a quark individually. It doesn't exist by
color
itself.
Confinement.
Right, color confinement.
As it's often called.
Yeah, that they suck together. But when these things are slammed together and they do, for some instance, pull apart, do you think we're getting new quarks are coming in, like the energy is being converted into quark pairs?
Yes, I believe that there are quark-anti-quark pairs that are what are often called mesons. At least that's one of them. I think there's pions also. But yeah, pi mesons. So pions would also be a type of meson, which is just a quark-anti-quark pair. Those are produced in these events, and it is for a just like I said, it's trillionths of a second. There we get what's called, like, if you smash two protons. The thing is that a proton. I'm going to get really, really abstract here, but hopefully it makes sense. If we were to shrink ourselves down to the size of a proton, which doesn't make sense anyway, because then there would be no you, because you are made of protons. But
Right.
abstracting here,
Sure.
but we're all imaginative here.
Yeah.
And you could sort of look at a proton. A proton isn't like a solid. It's not like a solid thing. It's more of like a system of a bunch of things interacting with each other. And so when two protons get close enough together, the energy, at least at CERN in the particle collider, the energy can get high enough to where you temporarily produce a quark gluon plasma, which is where temperatures get so hot, it's so energetic that color confinement is actually broken. And you can actually have quarks and gluons existing as sort of a plasma rather than bound into confined states. And that is how we know that there was probably quark gluon plasma very, 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 very early in the universe. But this is only very briefly. And then these quarks are, again, either confined into quark-anti-quark pairs or confined into what are called hadrons, which would be systems comprised of an odd number of quarks. It's usually only 3. We have, there are pentaquark systems, pentaquarks are called, which are made of 5. But yeah, that's a result of the color confinement. It has to do with the fact that gluons, which sort of carry the strong interactions, are themselves, they also have the charge of strong interactions. So strong interactions is a nuclear interaction like electromagnetism. Everybody's familiar with electromagnetism. Electromagnetism has a charge. We call it electric charge. It can come with a plus sign or a minus sign. So it could be positive or negative. The photon, which is what carries electromagnetism, so to speak, it is neutral. It does not carry electric charge. Well, in strong interactions, or strong nuclear force, as some people may have heard it as, there are 3 charges. We differentiate between those 3 charges just using the concept of color. One charge we call red, one charge we call green, one charge we call blue. The thing is, gluons carry strong interactions, much like photons carry electromagnetism. The difference is not just that there's 3 charges in strong interactions, but that gluons also carry color charge. And so I myself am not up to speed on it. I'm actually, hopefully, because I'm working through a series that Richard Beheal has on his channel that goes through, all of the mathematical apparatus of the quantum field theory and the effective field theory involved with like electromagnetism and quantum quantum chromodynamics. But I know that the reason that color confinement, asymptotic freedom is another thing that relates to that, has to do with the fact that gluons also carry color charge. I'm not sure how. I haven't gotten that far yet, but I do know that the fact that gluons carry color charge is part of the reason why you can't isolate quarks.
So let me ask you this. If the quantum field, if it is the case, and I don't know how we could in any way prove that it is the case, but if the quantum field existed before the Big Bang, I know that's a weird term to say, before the Big Bang, but let's say preceding that event or status of the Big Bang, we have the quantum field is present. Then that if what we're getting is in mass seems to be coming out of the quantum field when we've given electrical charge, that just seems to be pulling it out of the vacuum, that it seems in some sense the energy, the things that make mass was already present, that it was already there. Even if we can't think of it in terms of measuring it with time or space, that there's still a field that is present that has all of the unassembled components. If I hate to even think of it as component because it is a field, but there seems that in some sense, the sustenance of is already present. If that is in fact the case, that the field was there.
Yeah, if the field's there, then the energy is there. You just got to raise the energy of the field.
Yeah. So where do we run into problems with the PSR?
So I guess a good place to start with the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason. Almost everybody calls it the PSR these days, but that just means the principle of sufficient reason. I'm not sure if he was the first one to develop it, but I know he was one of the first that talked about something like this was Leibniz. And it's just this idea that for any fact F, there is some explanation E that is sufficient for why fact F obtains rather than not. I'm wearing a black shirt. There is something that explains why I'm wearing a black shirt instead of a green shirt or a blue shirt or a red shirt. And so that's sort of the idea behind the principle of sufficient reason, is that for any fact, there's a reason that explains why that fact obtains. Why is it true rather than false? Why is it cloudy today rather than sunny? Why does the sun appear yellow to us rather than purple or green or blue or pink? There's going to be facts that you can appeal to, something that you can appeal to that is sufficient to explain why it is that way rather than some other way. So that is, and there are a variety of different ways. There's strong PSR and weak PSR, and quite frankly, I haven't really looked much into that, just because, I mean, for better or for worse, it just doesn't interest me all that much because I'm not committed to a PSR, and I don't think making differentiating between a strong version and a weak version is likely to rescue the very notion of a PSR at all. But people like Josh Rasmussen have, I think, promoted something more of like a weak PSR that's supposed to be like the principle of sufficient reason, but something that's maybe a little bit more general, maybe that's a little bit more acceptable, that doesn't seem quite as strong as for every fact F, there is something else that is sufficient to explain why that fact obtains. Now, for me, the primary reason I reject the PSR is, at least initially, because I'm just not motivated to accept it. I think that I don't think explanations are these things out in the world so much as they are things humans seek about the world and the stuff in it and how we relate to it and all of that. And I don't think reality is obligated to provide those just because we seek them out. Now, that being said, that doesn't mean that there aren't good arguments against a PSR. But I guess before I get into the one argument against it, I don't know if you've got any questions or statements you'd like to make. You're muted. We've all done it once or twice.
The PSR, we run into these infinite regress things, and in science we try to, obviously they dodge infinite regresses if they can, but something you said a moment ago, I've said many times about infinite regress, is that there's no particular reason that an infinite regress could not be the case. That there's no particular reason. All that an infinite regress requires is the stage before has some explanatory value that caused that stage to be. So it could very well be the case that goes on indefinite. That having been said, it doesn't reach a satisfactory explanation. It reaches no foundational thing. And that's why, in large part, science tries to dodge PSRs, because it's like a kick in the can thing, that it just kicks the can further down the road and it has no explanatory value. But again, the universe doesn't owe us an explanation. You know, it's operating, it's doing its own thing, regardless of how we're operating with it. So I think that's well said. I don't think it does owe us anything, but I think it's just an observation that we have come to, that everything that seems to change from state A to state B, there seems to be something that is interacting in between. And subsequently we say, well, there has to be an interaction that is changing from state A to state B.
I think before I get into again, at least one argument against the PSR, it's probably one of the more prominent ones. It was actually given by a Christian. I should explain, no pun intended, sort of at least initially two different types of explanations. And explanation can be sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like divided up into different categories. Like there's metaphysical explanation, there's causal explanation, there's scientific explanation. What's the relationship between scientific and causal explanation? Are there kinds of explanations that are non-causal? If so, in virtue of what did they explain? There's actually a lot out there on the literature of explanation. I've read a little bit of it. I'm not going to claim that I'm an expert on it. It's an area I would like to read a little bit more about. But at least from a little bit of a more down to earth, more down to what the average person is going to have sort of already have some intuition for. There are about 2 types of explanations that factor into our everyday lives, and the way that I refer or choose to refer to them is there are mechanical explanations, and then there are intentional explanations. And I once heard William Lane Craig, surprisingly enough, give an example. I mean, he is a professional philosopher after all. You might disagree with him, but the guy's not a complete idiot. That I thought was a really, really good way of differentiating between those two. Suppose that you came down one morning and saw your wife, your partner, your mother, put whatever you want in for that story, they had a pot on the stove, and they were boiling water. And you ask your wife, why are you boiling water this morning? And she says, oh, well, the water is boiling because the stove that we have is utilizing gas and is utilizing a high temperature to break bonds in the molecules of that gas, which releases energy, which creates heat, which is then heating up the pan. And as a result of the pan, or the pot rather, getting hot, that is exciting the water molecules, causing them to break the bonds that they have and undergo a phase transition from liquid to steam. From liquid to gas as it becomes steam, which is causing this roiling of the water as the gas escapes out. Now, that is an explanation for why there was water boiling in the pot. That is a mechanical explanation. That would be a mechanical explanation for why there is water boiling in the pot. It's probably not the explanation that you were looking for when you asked. Now, suppose instead when you ask, your wife says, oh, I'm brewing some tea. Would you like some? That is an intentional explanation, an explanation in virtue of the intention of an agent. Now, granted, that might reduce, or some might say emerge, out of causal or mechanical explanations in terms of all of the various happenings in your wife's brain that led her to wanting to brew the tea, that led her to boiling the water. But it still makes a difference between the mechanical explanation and the intentional explanation. So those are at least 2 ways that we can sort of separate what kinds of explanations that we generally look for.
Yeah, I did a conversation a while back about this, about purpose. I did a video about purpose. It was right on the eve of Christmas. It was fairly low attendance, but it was a decent video, I think. And it was about purpose specifically. And I mentioned you can do this why question with ice, and you could say, but why does ice float? And if you're looking for agency explanation of why, as if God would have created ice to make it want to float, then you could come up with things kind of post hoc that, well, if he wanted ice to float to be able to create the land bridge so that people would even be able to get across from continent to continent. But we're looking for agenicity in the explanation as why it would be made to be so. Whereas if you're looking for mechanical explanations as to why ice floats, this is a totally different thing. But I think people have an affinity to the explanation that is an agent type explanation, that when people, they're not satisfied when you say, like if you ask the question, but why is the sky blue? People are not as satisfied with the explanation of wavelengths and different lengths of distance that light comes through. Doesn't seem to satisfy their why. And whereas, especially as young children, we have parents that will say, well, God likes the color blue. And this is an agency explanation. And the children, oh, okay. And that seems to be a satisfying thing. And I think as we grow up, we like agency explanations more.
There's the other one that I think that was done in a study some time ago, where they asked kids, why is this rock pointy? And they said, oh, so that bears can scratch their backs on the rock or something like that. We're seeking more of this intentional explanation rather than a mechanical explanation.
Sure.
And I do agree that I think that oftentimes people seek out an explanation, but what they're really seeking for is an agential or an intentional explanation. And I think that those aren't going to be found in a lot of instances, particularly with respect to the way that the world works. Those are going to be mechanical explanations. And I think that everybody, even most theists, can agree that at least mechanical explanations ground out somewhere. That with respect to the natural world that we inhabit, explanations ground out somewhere. I think we just disagree about where it is they ground out. I think that it just grounds out in the brute contingent structure of the world fundamentally. They think it grounds out one step further in some necessarily existent entity that chose it to be that way. So the idea that explanation sort of ground out somewhere, you reach a stopping point eventually, I think is agreed upon by most people. I think the disagreement is where that happens to be.
Yeah, and when you talk about like our own mind, to some degree, that becomes, it transitions from the agency to the mechanical operations of what it is that constitutes the mind. So when you say something like, "Why did I drink water today?" This is a mind thing that at some point grounds out mechanically. It grounds out pragmatically for the mechanical functions of the mind and whatnot. So it's strange that we think that that'll ground out, and we know that neurological firings, in particular neurological order, and just the way in the structure of the brain is making certain decisions, that is a mechanical function. Whereas when people talk about an agency that is God, like, why does God act when there's nothing there? Why does God, is he inspired to act? And then there's this idea that there's not a mechanical function that is causal, right? That it's just something that he just decides with spontaneity without a causal thing, which is strange to me.
That also leads into some issues, and I guess now we can sort of get into some arguments about the PSR, because this is one of them, is this notion of libertarian free will, which is the idea that we have freedom of the will in the sense that there are no antecedent causes to our decisions. The decisions come strictly from the agent in sort of this random or spontaneous way. But the thing is that seems to suggest then that there is no further explanation for the there is no sufficient reason for why an agent at the end of the decision chain, so to speak, there is no sufficient reason for why the agent made that choice. You might say, oh, well, I chose to do X rather than Y. Well, why did you choose to do X rather than Y? Well, because I had, E prior rather than H prior. Well, why did you have E prior rather than H prior? Well, because I look at the world through the P framework rather than the Q framework. But why do you look at the world? And you can go back, but once you reach the end of it, then it just stops. There's no sufficient, under libertarian free will, there is no further sufficient reason for why this rather than that at the bottom of that entire chain that led up to the decision being made. And that this would be true even for God. But then this seems to run counter to the intuition that we're informed by the PSR, that there are sufficient reasons for the truth of all facts that obtain. So if it's a fact that you made some decision, why, under libertarian free will, did you make that decision rather than some other? And it seems that the libertarian here is just committed to saying that there simply is no sufficient reason. And so I think that it's very hard to reconcile a principle of sufficient reason if one takes a libertarian view of free will. And that is one objection to the principle of sufficient reason, generally pushed against theists who want to hold to, a lot of Christians and perhaps Muslims who want to hold to some notion of libertarian free will, either for our minds or for God's, and at the same time want to appeal to a PSR, usually to push some sort of contingency argument. Muted.
I seen it that time. I actually seen it, but I was going for it. But sometimes I adjust this chair and it's got a bunch of squeaks and stuff. Yeah, I've seen the argument before about status. If you think about the moment in which God, let's think, if we could try to think of it in moments, because I know the ideal is that this is before time and space. But if we're thinking about it, even if we're not thinking about it in terms of moments, we're thinking about it in terms of stages. If we can say that at one point there is a stage which God is not wanting to create humanity. He does not have the hair up his butt to create humanity. He doesn't want to create. And then there is a transition from that state. We'll call that state zero, right? And then we'll say state one is the state in which he now wants to create the universe. So he come to a conclusion that the God wants to create. So the problem is, what is the PSR between state 0 and state 1? How do you even get from don't want to create, now you want to create? And it seems that when you're talking about terms of PSR and you're fighting and arguing for the PSR, there's no explanation for this. There's no explanation for why not create, now create. So it seems that they act as if they're not running into their own problem with the strictest, firmest sense of the PSR, but I think they clearly are.
Mm-hmm. A lot of them will try to argue that, well, the explanation is just the freedom of the will of the agent, but that's not really explaining it, because what we're questioning is the actions from the freedom of that will. Why did the agent freely choose X rather than Y?
Yeah,
and if one wants to say that, well, there is no reason because, libertarian free will, then again, that seems to violate the very principle of sufficient reason that many of them would like to appeal to. Yeah. There is another objection to the PSR that was given by Peter Van Inwagen,
okay,
who was a I say was, I'm almost certain he's not still alive. I'm like very, very certain he's not still alive, but don't quote me. What he said is, okay, so if you take sort of the conjunct of all contingent facts and you want to say, okay, well, what sufficiently explains that? Suppose that there was something, whatever you want to posit it to be, whether it's a god or something else, just suppose there is some sufficient explanation, but that itself is necessary, like God is often claimed to be. Well, then if it is truly necessary and it truly is sufficient for explaining all the contingent facts, then all of those facts are necessarily explained and thus wouldn't be contingent.
Right.
So then you wouldn't have a collection of contingent facts. However, if the explanation is not necessary, then it's contingent and is thus a part of the set of the contingent facts that needs to be explained. And so you have a problem with a contingent fact trying to effectively explain itself. And so you can see clearly, I think, the problem here with positing a sort of a necessary, sufficient explanation for you might hear in the literature BCCF, or it's the big conjunction of contingent facts. Take every fact that is contingent and like make the set of all contingent facts. Again, if something is truly necessary and it truly is sufficient to explain those facts, then those facts are just necessary. But if it's not necessary, then it's contingent and thus is a part of that BCCF. And so it just seems that a PSR just doesn't seem to really, it seems that it's going to entail some sort of contradiction there.
Sure.
And that was Van Inwagen's argument against a PSR.
Against the PSR. Well, in fairness, we've had people that have suggested for the longest time, since Bertrand Russell's paradox, that self-referential statements are problematic. The liar's paradox is a self-referential statement also. So it may very well be the case, or in the straight form. There's other forms that you could put the liar's paradox that it's not self-referential. Like you could do the two sentences. This sentence A applies to sentence B and back and forth. But for the most part, we think self-referential statements could just be causing things in logic that they're causing problems.
Mm-hmm.
So when we're talking about things, putting something inside of the set of those things, it's likely going to cause some problems. But
if a set is a part of, or if a fact is a part of the set of facts that it attempts to explain, then it's not sufficient for explaining it.
Right. But we kind of run into this with like God is outside of time and space, right? But God is acting outside of. So how is action? If action is a thing that seems to be inside of the set that is inside of time and space, right? But now we have action that has to be outside of that to be able to create it. So it's a bit of problematic nonsense.
In fact, I think it's very, very problematic for the classical Christian theist. Because this whole notion, well, how could God create outside of time if creation is an action and actions require time? Even setting aside God's omnipotence, I mean, that it's a problem that the world's foremost Christian philosophers will recognize. One of the foremost Christian philosophers just says, oh, well, God's creation of time is simultaneous with time's coming into being, and so is not thereby technically outside of time, which would be true if the notion of absolute simultaneity is something that held, and we know through special relativity that it doesn't. which is why this particular Christian philosopher rejects Einsteinian relativity for a neo-Lorentzian view, which has its problems in producing something like general relativity and giving us a description of gravity, and it doesn't fit neatly with quantum mechanics to produce a relativistic quantum mechanics or a quantum field theory, which is why almost nobody in physics accepts a neo-Lorentzian view, and hasn't for a very, very, very long time. Heinrich Lorentz himself abandoned his own view once he realized that special relativity was clearly the right framework. So, and I'm talking about William Lane Craig, of course. So it's a problem to the extent that one of the foremost Christian philosophers has to reject like the fundamental, like the foundation of modern physics, just to rescue the notion of simultaneous, of absolute simultaneity, just so that he can say that God's creation of time is simultaneous with time's coming into being, because this notion of creation absent time is a huge problem, because creation is an action and actions require time.
Well, that particular philosopher, if you will, has already abandoned his charge, I think, whenever he says if there's even the slightest possible chance. So when he appeals to probability, that is the most minuscule probability, that we still have to accept that thing as true because of reasons of personal, incredulity. I think he's already abandoned any logic openly, in my opinion.
I mean, there's a lot of other problems with his view, because it seems like with respect to like certain features of relativity, he takes an instrumentalist view, which is where science is more just a series of instruments or tools that we use for making predictions and developing models, but it doesn't necessarily like reveal the ontology of the world, so to speak. It's not telling us, science doesn't tell us what the world really is. It just helps us make predictions and develop models about it. So that's sort of this view about scientific instrumentalism, because Craig often says things like, well, time dilation and length contraction aren't actually physically real effects in the world. They're just features of our mathematics, which is manifestly instrumentalist. But then the claims that he makes with respect to cosmology seem to be more rooted in a scientific realist perspective. The idea that science really does tell us what the structure of the world really is. Electrons aren't just merely calculational tools. Electrons are actually real, physical, existing things in the world. Yeah. So that also seems to be an inconsistency in Craig's view that I at least, as somebody who followed Craig very, very closely when I was a Christian, and still follows his work relatively closely, I haven't seen him really address any of these charges. Though I haven't really seen a lot of people charge him with this, which I think they should. I'm curious to see, this is sort of off topic, but I'm curious to see how Alex Malpass will perform in his debate with William Lane Craig that occurs in April or May. It occurs in several weeks, I think. What is on Premiere Unbelievable, I think, is what it's going to be on. I'm very, very curious to see how Alex Malpass is going to approach that, because the debate is on the Kalam, so that's going to be very, very interesting.
Yeah, it's definitely one to tune into, and maybe I'll want to put in a link in the video description towards the end of this. But do you think you in large part have covered this, or what's your main thing as to, we talked about a bunch of different models, but you didn't talk about your model specifically that you subscribe to, as to how this, how everything starts, and how dismissive of you are some of the other models. I think you to some degree mentioned that you're fairly dismissive of cyclical models. But so where are you at on this? How do you think it all kicked off, and how does this dodge the PSR, or does it dodge the PSR?
So I'm not sure whether the universe had a beginning or not. I think that's what most cosmologists, I think, would say, is we just don't really know at this point in time whether or not the universe had a beginning in some sort of absolute sense. I think that, at least for the sake of discussion, I can grant it, because I don't think it rescues, it doesn't really rescue any sort of like Kalam style cosmological argument. And that's going to be for reasons related to my views on time. My main issue with cyclic cosmologies is just we don't really have anything that suggests the universe is cyclic. There's also issues with respect to thermodynamics for cyclic models. Now, those aren't like the biggest issues, but they still can pose problems. With respect to the PSR, generally a PSR is usually just it factors into contingency arguments that, well, if the universe is contingent and thus could have been otherwise, then there needs to be something that's sufficient for explaining why it is rather than not. And what would that be? And then you're going to hear, well, an infinite regress of explanations is obviously not going to be parsimonious, so we don't want that.
Sure.
Brute contingencies aren't satisfactory, so we don't want that. So it seems that we're going to need something necessary. And this is where it's a stage 1 versus stage 2 contingency argument. Is the stage 1 is just to get you to the idea that there needs to be something necessary that is sufficient for explaining the universe. And then stage 2 is trying to get you to that necessary thing happens to be God. So, and there are skeptics and atheists who will grant stage 1, but not stage 2, and think, like, I think Graham Oppie thinks that the initial, just whatever the initial state of the universe was, if it had one, and if it didn't, then whatever the fundamental state of the universe is, just is necessary, and that's that. So I think one can grant that there is maybe something necessary that is sufficient for explaining it. It still doesn't, that alone isn't going to get you all the way to there being a God. And I just choose to reject a PSR altogether because why should I accept it? I've never heard a good argument for why I should accept it. And then I think there are good arguments for not. I think Van Wagen's argument works. Obviously, there's people. I think Rob Koons has written an objection to Van Wagen's argument against the PSR. Oh God, I want to say there's somebody else's name I can't think off the top of my head that's also written a response to that. I think I remember reading Koons' response to it, and I didn't find it very convincing, but I'm not motivated to accept it, and I think that the arguments out there for it are pretty good arguments against there being a PSR. And while brute contingency might be unsatisfactory to some people, I don't think that it being unsatisfactory entails that it's false or that it's not the right picture of the world. The world is the way that it is, and that's just the way that it is.
Is it strange to you that brute contingency is unsatisfying to people, though, but agency being the end, being the foundation, like, is satisfying? It seems like that almost tells us something about our psychology, because like if we're talking about like brute reality and we're saying, well, that's not satisfying, but for some reason, for so many people, saying agency is satisfying, but we still don't have a way of defining that agency or how that agency interacted with. That seems to be that's just a preference that just seems to rise out of our psyche to say agency is there at the very end. It's something that we're only satisfied, it seems, because we wanted that to be what was there at the end, not bruteness.
I think it's a bit more vague even than something like brute contingency, which I don't think is vague. In that, okay, so why did the agent create it this way rather than some other way? It seems to just push the question back. And I don't think anybody is going to be able to provide any sort of meaningful or forceful argument in favor of having any sort of access to the desires of this agent to know what it wants or what it didn't. And I don't think that you can reason that because the world is the way that it is, that therefore that's what the agent would have wanted it to be. That just seems very post hoc.
Oh, that's definitely.
So I wouldn't accept that as an argument that, well, it is this way, so it must have wanted it to be that way. I think it's easier to say it is this way, and then that's just it. Like that's just it.
Yeah. Look at the trees. Yep. The trees are there. No particular reason. But you know, what's strange is when we compare these things to like design, because this is what's commonly done in the teleological argument, is the teleological argument starts where this left off, like the agency. And we say, but the reason that we assume agency is because of this looks design. But does it though? Because when we look at like a designer and we say anything that any human has ever made, what's the maximum amount of waste that a human, like anything that a human has made, let's say they made a house, and let's say that the amount of material that they throw away is 20% of the total material. Whereas if we're talking about an entity that made Earth, the amount of wasted material in the universe is like 99.999 on and on. The amount that seems to be completely useless material is just so exponentially high that it is indistinguishable from randomity rather than agency. Agency doesn't have that amount of waste. It just doesn't.
And the other thing with this, well, it looks designed. And I always, the one question that if you ever hear when you're talking with a theist and you ever say, oh, well, but such and such looks designed, one simple question, in virtue of what does it look
Yeah.
designed? Then they'll usually appeal to some sort of complexity or order or function. And you can just say, well, in virtue of what are those indicators of design? There's a variety of things that have those that are not designed. Snowflakes, crystals, or highly organized structures. There's a variety of complex structures and chemicals that can form in reality. None of this is designed. And then there are things that are designed that are not complex and that don't have functions. So in virtue of what are those indicators of design? And the problem is that things like the physical structure of some object or the processes that it engages in are not what we infer design from. Design is inferred from our priors about what is and isn't designed. So if you were walking along the beach and you came across a watch in the sand, a wristwatch, and you picked it up, you don't know it's designed because it tells you the time. You don't know it's designed because it's got numbers on it. You don't know it's designed because of any of the physical features of the watch. You know it's designed because you know that humans design watches. And so it's not just that you know that it's designed, you know who designed it, a human. And you know that because you know that humans design watches. Well, we don't have any priors about life being designed. We've never seen life be designed. So we don't have anything from which we could infer that it is.
So the first time that the first English writer wrote about the Giant's Causeway, when he approached the Giant's Causeway, when he first saw it, and there was already, tales about it that they said it was made by fairies, it was made by giants. One of them, I think, was a tale of a giant serpent that had landed there, and that this was the remains of the giant serpent. But the first English gentleman that saw the Giant's Causeway and all of these pillars that seemed to be, I won't say perfect, but hexagonal patterns, he immediately thought someone must have built this. Who built this? Who designed this thing? But now we know this is obviously not designed. This is something that nature creates the shape. We could say the same thing on the beach, and let's replace the watch with something super asymmetric, super asymmetric, like a snowflake. And we could look at that snowflake extremely close and say, how could this not be designed? This is super intricate. Yep. It is so asymmetric all the way around. But now we know how, we have priors. We understand how snowflakes are formed and how they form as they come down, and that they're not designed, that they're just systemically created through systemic processes in the same way that the Giant's Causeway was. But at first glance, they might appear to be designed. They're just not.
Yep, I agree.
That having been said, you said you're working on anything, or you're fixing to start doing some shorts, or what you got going on, man? We're fixing to jump into in a few minutes, open Q&A and take some questions.
Yeah, there's some Jay Dyer stuff that I've seen recently that I think I might respond to. Just because, I don't know, it's fun to goad people like Jay Dyer and Jim Bob because they think they know what they're talking about, and they just so obviously don't. My challenge is still out there. Jay Dyer can debate me and he can talk all the philosophy he wants, and he's not going to do well in that debate. But other than that, once I get this editing software and everything down pat, I'm going to start. There's been some debates I've had on some channels. I'm going to cut those up and then get those posted to my channel. There was one thing that I wanted to share, and it's not because this makes it correct, but I think that it kind of just shows how the professionals are thinking about these things. And that is the 2020 Phil Paper survey. And this is amongst all respondents, so just all philosophers. I mean, you could specify epistemologists, moral philosophers, philosophers of science. This is just all philosophers. And you can see that a plurality of philosophers think that the principle of sufficient reason is false. So this is not something that most philosophers are probably going to be motivated by. Obviously, there are still quite a bit of philosophers that are motivated by the principle of sufficient reason, this idea. But that being said, I don't know how far up I'll have to go to find it. There is something else I can show that I think is pretty interesting. Where is it? I think it's toward the top, actually. One of the first questions. that is asked on the survey right here. I don't think most of those philosophers who accept the PSR think it has anything to do with theism. As we can see, there is a clear consensus amongst Western analytic philosophers as to whether they prefer theism or atheism. Again, this does not mean that atheism must be true. I'm not arguing that this means atheism is true. I'm just showing you how philosophers think about this. And I think that it does lend some sort of credence to atheism as a view. It doesn't make it more true, but it certainly shows that atheism is something that is serious and something that its detractors are going to need to contend with.
Sure.
And I also think that it shows that when we hear from a lot of theists out there that, oh, well, theism is it's just obvious. It's philosophically trivial. Well, clearly it isn't, because the consensus of philosophers is that, well, they prefer atheism over theism. So.
Yeah. It seems to me, even if you just look at this Bayesian analysis, like if any of these models, whether any of the models that we've talked about, or even the cyclical model, whether they're more likely true based on the information that we have, one of these models, it seems, are bound to be true as to what's going on, or something that is not agency. The agency doesn't. It just seems to me to be the least likely possibility that this is what caused it. Am I saying
Agreed.
that this is completely not possible that agency is involved in that? I wouldn't say that, but I would say that it just seems so enormously improbable that agency needs to be a part of it to start with. It's so enormously improbable that you get causation from a static position, that there's consciousness somehow, but it's non-temporal consciousness, as if thoughts can exist without time, and then that thoughts just have a moment in which they activate. This seems to be just utter nonsense to me. So it doesn't seem to be probable. We don't have any priors of consciousness that can operate or think non-temporally. The amount of examples that we have of that,
or even non-biologically, we have no examples of any sort of true non-biological consciousness, which I think is quite interesting.
Right. So just based on priors, this just seems, I don't even know how to give it a probability score, because all of its kind of, there's no inductive reasoning. There's no like, oh, well, we have an example of this happening, this consciousness that operates without some kind of physical substrate, right? We don't have that to start with. So all of the propositions of it, it just seems that we can't even put it on the board of probability.
Yeah. There are no strong inductive priors for this notion of design such that we could conditionalize some probability for its occurrence. And I think that there is a sense in which that's true. People will disagree, but then, you get into a debate about subjective versus objective priors. I think that outside of extremely niche instances, probably involving logic or mathematics, you can't really have objective priors. Almost all priors are going to be subjective. So, I personally, I don't agree with that statement. I think atheism is true. I think it's clear that there are no gods. I would argue, I think atheism is just trivially true. Okay.
Right. Well, there's two different ways to think about this, though. You can think about atheisms in terms of if we're defining it as a position that we don't hold, or that it's a belief, that how is it that I believe or I don't believe is an outside, true statement. So there's people that'll argue it this way and say, in that sense, I don't even like the word atheism. I'm not a fan of atheism, right? As if it's something of people who don't hold this true. It seems like fairyism. And we're talking about the collective identity that me and you have, that we don't believe fairies are true, and we're speaking of it as a collective identity. But I don't know. Different people are going to have different things with that. We're going to open the stream up. We're going to, that's the link. Yeah, if y'all have questions, Q&A is now open. The link is pinned to come on in.
I'm going to run to the little boys' room real quick.
Okay, absolutely. But anybody that wants to chat on the subject, anybody that has a few questions, start putting them in the link. Chat is open. If you are having any problems with the link, please let me know. Simos, how you been, man? This is actually a great opportunity. I'm going to bring Robin on the stage here in a moment, but I wanted to take a moment before I brought Robin up here because this is something that I wanted to announce. I want to give a proper and official apology, first of all, to Tilting Windmill. Tilting Windmill, it has been brought to my attention through a video that someone else made of my video. I watched me call you Tillman. And then I started looking back to see how many times I have done this. Tillman is somebody that I used to talk with on the philosophy channel. I haven't talked to him in over 6 months, and I see your name and I wind up seeing the short of it, and I say Tillman, and I want to say I apologize, and I'm not going to do that. And the other thing that I wanted to do, I wanted to thank Robin very much. She has plugged my channel, and I appreciate it. So we got a few people that are starting to come onto the stage here. Robin, how's it going? We also got Dark Light coming in. Dark Light, how's it going, man? Robin, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I was going to let Dane talk.
Dane, is that the name? I guess she's already so familiar with everybody. You are muted. You're muted.
You're muted, bub.
Dark Light, if you can hear us, you are muted. So anyway, we'll let him work that out. Robin, how's it been going? What's your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, I had a question for Leo because, which I love listening to Leo. I don't always fully understand everything he says. Like he kind of, he goes through pretty fast, and like sometimes I get lost back in the sauce. But like I wanted to ask him because he was talking about what was the question I had? Okay, when you talked about the universe having a beginning, were you referring to like just like the beginning of all the stuff, or the quantum field, maybe, or something, or the beginning of our local presentation of the universe, like the 14.6 billion? And I don't even know if Leo can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
When I refer to beginning, I'm usually referring to some sort of absolute beginning.
Okay. So like just the beginning of all the stuff, or all the things that make stuff, or whatever. Okay. Yeah.
I subscribe to the idea that there was no absolute beginning. There very well may have been a beginning, but I think it is more likely that it is one of, an infinite amount of beginnings. That the began always was may have began.
You're starting to break up a little bit there, but yeah, I think you're not alone in that. I think we got a lot of people that thinks that it may have just moved through stages or states. It's weird to think of, like, when you can't use the terminology time, it is weird to think of it. But if there were previous states, it seems like that we still have something that is to some degree equivalent, that there's stages of, and we want to think of these things to some degree as temporal, or at least we're compelled to think of them as temporal. Quiet moment here. What's up? Anybody want to come in? Q&A is open.
I think that so I find it interesting though that you maybe don't believe in cyclical universe, like, and I guess I struggle with this right here because I want to put everything like in a linear time mode, and I know that's probably incorrect, like, and so like the word I don't usually say before the Big Bang, but I try, like, sometimes I say prior. I don't know if that's any difference, but it just seems to like release the idea of time, I guess. So with this necessary thing, like say the quantum field is a necessary thing, would that just kind of have just be eternal in that state, or?
I'm not sure. I don't take quantum fields to be necessarily existent. The very concept of something existing necessarily doesn't make much sense to me. I'm not sure what it would be in virtue of that something exists necessarily outside of mere stipulation.
Okay, I thought you were talking about. I know you said something about one quantum field, like original quantum field or something.
Well, a lot of people think that like there's a quantum field and that all the particles come from a quantum field, but there are a multitude of quantum fields.
Okay.
Right, and I don't think we only abstractly even know what the fields are, right? There's something that's numerically present to some degree, but that's our only interaction with is the numeric interaction with those quantum fields.
We know that quantum fields are physically real entities. We can actually describe them quite well with the apparatus of quantum field theory. It's just the way that they behave, if you want to use that word, it's not intuitive. Most of quantum mechanics is non-intuitive. I think that's where most people get tripped up, is that it doesn't fit into your everyday ideas about how you think the world works. I tell people, well, as I'll get, quantum fields are physical. What are they made of? They're not made of anything. They are non-composite physical entities. This might come off a little bit strong. I don't intend it to be that way, but I don't care if it doesn't make sense to you. That's the way the world is. They are there. They are physical entities. They are non-composite, and they are almost certainly fundamental. Now, I'm not going to say they're the only fundamental thing, but they're at least one class of fundamental entities in physical reality. There might be other ones, and we haven't found those yet, but quantum fields are at least one class of fundamental entities in the physical world.
Yeah, well, it's a good thing you don't care, because like you would spend a lot of time worrying about trying to make me understand something that I may not ever understand, and I'm cool with that.
Well, the biggest
you'll
thing
understand it. You just got to dedicate time. This is the thing with it's not. So yes, physics is hard, but it's hard not in the sense that the ideas cannot be understood, but that it just takes a lot of time to understand them, because there is a lot of parts that go into understanding it.
Yeah.
So the thing is about intuition is we are only going to have intuition about things like time and space that we exist in and come to. I mean, the brain is not a perfect thing. It is a thing that is evolved to be, and it is evolved inside of the space. And this is the sea in which it swims. It's not as if something that lives at the bottom of the ocean can comprehend how elephants eat, or their digestive system. It's not something that they can. That is they don't live in that environment. They've never been exposed to that. They have not evolved in it. It has no pragmatism to them whatsoever. It doesn't seem to do anything for their brain. So it seems to me that when we're talking about things like quantum mechanics, or if we're even thinking about concepts of the time and space not existing, that we're going to have comprehension problems. That's due to the limitation that our brain arose inside of this space and not inside of that space. To some degree, we cannot think outside of the box in which our consciousness has arose.
One way I like to put it is, if you can imagine all the scales of reality, from the smallest to the largest, spanning the floor, which would be quantum fields, and the ceiling, which would be the universe, the thickness of the scale in which your intuition was built is probably thinner than that of a hair. That is the scale of reality into which everything that you are, everything that you've ever seen and ever known exists. That is the scale in which your intuition is built. To think that when you start going beyond that, particularly far beyond that, that reality wouldn't conform to your intuitions, I think is almost silly. Of course it will. That doesn't mean that that's not the world. That doesn't mean it's not physically real. That doesn't mean it's not there. And that doesn't mean we can't understand it. It just means that it doesn't fit into our everyday experience of how the world is, because our everyday experience is confined to an extraordinarily narrow range of the total scale of reality.
Yeah.
Also, I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm going to enjoy an apple here real quick. I'll
Sure.
still be listening, and I'll still be able to answer questions.
Sure. I'll go a step further on this and say that scale that we're talking about, that human hair thickness, it's going to be remarkably similar to the scale of information that is pragmatic and beneficial to you. Though there may be information that's pragmatic and beneficial to humankind that is obviously a slightly thicker hair, that information is beneficial to, that is slightly larger than that which is the intuitions, but I don't think it's going to be tremendously larger. So much of the information and much of that, the fields and the things that exist in the universe, they're just not practical to us. They're not pragmatic. They don't serve us any purposes.
Yeah, and we didn't like our brain didn't evolve to to digest that information. You know what I mean? Like that wasn't something that was in our evolutionary history to try to understand, comprehend. You know, we were more, you know, like our brain evolved to help us survive, pretty much. You know, to like continue survival.
Yeah, Dark, you've been fairly quiet on the subject. Driving?
Yeah, I'm driving right now. I'm almost home, so I'm kind of like paying attention to the road, not dying as much.
I hear you. Sure.
So I'll be pulling up home here in about 5 minutes or so.
I hear you. Anybody got any questions? Put them in the comments. Put them in the side chat. We've been talking about the PSR, the principle of sufficient reason, and the first cause argument, or first cause in general, how it all kicked off. I think we could shift gears a little bit more from what the reality of it is to what the arguments are and why those arguments fall apart to some degree. Because I think anyone that has been in this subject, anyone that is in the, I think I like the term atheosphere. Anyone that's been in this, they have run into, or people that are not atheists, but they're inside of this skeptical sphere of, and proclamations of this entity, my entity that I subscribe to and have a religion of, that it has to exist because reality exists. And there's this, you can't explain how reality exists. I can by imbuing agency had to create it. And I think that is a poor argument. It is a very poor argument. It's just saying, look at this, look at reality, look at the tree. That has some intuition to, or should have some intuition to you to say that some external entity had to have created it. And I think that's a horrible argument.
I've heard this, like there's a lot of stuff that when I come in, I don't, like that's the, what is it, the problem of sufficient reason? Is that what it is? PSR?
Principle of sufficient
reason. See, I've heard that mentioned several times, and probably heard Leo say it several times, and I never really knew what it was. You know, sometimes you kind of hate to ask questions like, because you think, well, so I already know this, but like I never was in a position to where I could ask somebody, you know, that was like I was speaking one-to-one with somebody, like.
Yeah, well, when you Google things like PSR, you'll probably run into some companies or whatnot if you're doing it as abbreviations. But the vast majority of the things that we're talking about, if it's in a subject that's in philosophy, or if it's in a subject that is in cosmology or whatever, if you just put that along with it, so like with PSR, you could do PSR philosophy, and it'll get you to that we're talking about the principle of sufficient reason. And I think that tends to be the case with any category that you're not familiar with. If you have an abbreviation such as PSR, or I'm trying to think of another one, maybe what's the Giant Hadron Collider's abbreviation? But if you put that, if you just put science behind those abbreviations, LHC, there you go, Large Hadron Collider. So if you put, or CERN even, if you put science behind those, you'll see immediately what it is that's referred to. Pull Wikipedia pages on it. So abbreviations sometimes are a little difficult to Google because you have to put the category in which the abbreviation applies to. But plenty of information on the PSR. It's been around in some form for a very long time. I think it's been most formally by the not Heisowitz. I'm trying to think of the damn name. It was just said earlier. Leo said the name of it. I forget the name.
Leibniz.
But Leibniz. There you go. But it's been around a long time, though, in some form or another, that A causes B, that there has to be an action that changes the state of.
See,
Or
like
the concept has.
the word sufficient, like to me, it's interesting that theists want to propose God is that, and like that to me, that's not sufficient at all. You know what I mean? Like it's the answer.
Yeah, well, to be clear though, Robin, we do have things that we can't see in association where there is I'll give you a primary thing is the decay of atoms. When atoms start to decay, like what causes them to start to decay. We can see it in the aggregate. Like we can see a pattern of when you have a bunch of atoms that we can, to some degree, predict when we're going to start get atomic decay. But as to what is causing the beginning of the atomic decay, we can't validate that. We don't know how or why it's starting to happen.
Yeah, I agree.
So,
Yeah, I agree that there's probably things that we cannot recognize the cause of. Like I think, but I've learned to kind of since I gave up theism to say that just because we don't recognize it means that there's something going on, magic. Like
yeah.
It's just just because we're not recognizing it, it's just stuff we haven't learned yet.
Leo, do you think there are any things, or do you think that the atoms and when the atoms start to break down, do you think that is something that causes a little bit of problem with PSR? Or do you think there are any particular phenomenon that we see that is not accounted for in the PSR, that we don't think that anything particularly is causing it, that it seems to happen with some spontaneity?
I think it depends on what you mean by sufficient reason. Some might argue, obviously radioactive decay is a stochastic process, but it occurs as a result of weak interactions. And some might say, well, the weak interactions are sufficient for explaining why radioactive decay occurs at all, even if we can't predict when any one particular decay event occurs. So I think it just depends on how one's cashing out sufficient reason there.
Yeah. Well, it's like if you're doing it if you're doing a group of atoms, I mean, you can make some predictive models on, but
half-lives,
right, half-lives. But as far as looking at one atom and saying when that atom is going to make any state of change, like we have no idea. You can, to the best of my knowledge, we can examine the shit out of that atom, and we just aren't going to know whenever that stage.
Yeah, you can't predict when one single uranium atom is going to decay. But if you have a collection of uranium atoms, you can predict how much is going to have decayed over a certain period of time.
Right. Yeah. So it seems like to some degree that this is at the smallest scale that we just don't know. I'm not saying that there's not something. Obviously, we know what's causing it. The bonds do just break down over time. That those bonds lose power, but it's not as if we can measure that in any way and say, well, this particular one will break down. So I'm not sure. Maybe that's more in line with the weak PSR version, but it seems that it causes maybe some problems with the stronger PSR anyway. Do you know of any other things that happens, as I mentioned, with some kind of spontaneously, or that we don't know of any particular reason that it's happening?
Tunneling is generally considered stochastic.
Okay.
Tunneling would be like, so if you get, and this is how stars like our sun work, is if you get, naturally you have two protons, they're both positively charged, they're going to repel each other electrostatically. That is the Coulomb force, which can be, I think it can either be the attractive or repulsive force depending on the charges, the force that they feel between each other. But if you get protons, you can add energy and get protons closer and closer together at some point, and you can't predict when. It's stochastic, that there are no antecedent determining conditions for when it happens. Those protons will just tunnel through that Coulomb barrier and stick together. And they stick together because of strong interactions, which are stronger than electromagnetism, and so overcome the electrostatic repulsion the protons would otherwise feel. And then usually in that process, since there's a bunch of electrons flying around, one of those protons will absorb an electron and decay into a neutron via the emission of a positron and an electron neutrino, I believe.
Right. This is something when I mentioned earlier when you're talking about like the state of God wanting to create and the state of God not wanting to create, that we have the zero position and then you have a one position, and that we can't define the change in between the zero and the one position. That we're always going to run into that, whether you're talking about it with God or whether you're talking about it with tunneling or with atoms. There's a point where it is the zero position, and now there's this point where it's the one position. And can we say that anything particular caused the state of change? No. We cannot identify the cause thereof.
The God is the gap where God lives today. It's a very small gap, but still.
Sometimes these things are, and sometimes there aren't. to use the almond, the old almond. Sometimes there is, sometimes there's not. But if we got any more questions, if not, we're only going to be a few more minutes, and we're going to go around and do the follow-ups. Any questions? We'll give you about 5 more minutes. Put anything in the side chat. I did want to see this. Skeptic philosophy is not what the world entropy is for. Yeah, well, entropy is just it is the slow and certain breakdown, but that's not what's causing it. It's an observation thereof. It's not a causal thing.
And entropy doesn't really cause things to happen. It's more just a description of how thermodynamic systems will evolve over time. Given that they're closed or isolated to any energy or matter inputs, then the system, if it has energy, is going to be able to do work on the stuff with the energy. And as that energy is used to do work, the ability of the energy to continue to do work goes down. This is only true for closed and isolated systems, and the universe naturally is an isolated thermodynamic system. It isn't exchanging matter or energy with anything, quote unquote, outside of it, which I don't know what that would refer to anyway.
Yeah, I want to be clear here, though. The universe is a closed system, but interactions between us and right. But interactions between the sun and the earth,
that's open.
That's completely open. We're constantly getting energy.
The earth is getting energy from the sun.
Right. So the reason that I mentioned that, and I think you know why I mentioned that, because we have a lot of people that argue this in thermodynamics that are on
but don't you know the second law of thermodynamics says you can't get life without the second law of thermodynamics.
Right. Okay.
Dogs turn into mosquitoes.
That's why I wanted to add a clarifier here to speak on the subject, because as soon as I heard it, I was like, the universe is a closed system, but yeah, that's fine. But the interaction between us and other energies, we're getting radiation, we're getting things that are coming in constantly. Even some of the mass of the Earth is not only coming in from radiation dust, but it's also being created from this radiation from the sun that is being transformed by trees. Like a lot of the trees that we have, the grass, the greenery that we have, they're getting mass literally from the sun. So they're definitely not a closed system in that regard.
And what is the law that says that matter cannot be created or destroyed?
That's technically there is no thermodynamic law that says that. The first law states that it relates the energy of a system and the work that a system does. I was just looking at this the other day when I was correcting somebody. What is it? U is equal to like Q minus W. What is it? The total energy of the system is equal to the work done by the system minus the energy input into the system, or something like that. But like matter cannot be created or destroyed is not technically what the first law of thermodynamics says.
Well, it says energy anyway. Not
referring to the laws of thermodynamics are sort of like the amendments. The second one's the only one that anybody knows.
Yeah, pretty much. That's about it.
Or they've heard of the zeroth law, which blowed them out. They're like, how do you have a zeroth law? Which is kind of defining the parameters in which the construct sets. They had to go back and say, we didn't define like the parameters of the whole ideology and what it sits in. So now let's call that the zeroth law.
I had to look it up. It's the change in the system's internal energy is equal to the heat added to the system minus the work done by the system. Delta U is equal to Q minus W.
I see why they skipped that one.
Well, that's a big one. That's a big one because of PPM ones of the first kind, perpetual motion machines of the first kind.
Yep, which do
they're-
not exist.
They don't exist. They don't exist. But when something's moving, it's losing some of that energy in any kind of interaction with any type of friction, anything. So if it could theoretically not lose any energy whatsoever, which is not possible just because of the nature of entropy itself, that we could have continuous energy, but it still wouldn't be usable because even the act of us using that energy in any way. So even if a PPM could be created, using that energy, it's not creating new energy. Even if it could just maintain itself indefinite, it's not creating new, so you can't draw anything off of it. So PPM ones they're destroyed right out the gate. They cannot be.
That's why an internal combustion engine could only at best run at about 50% efficiency, and even getting to there would be a challenge.
Yeah, we've seen some dam models of the dam engines. Their efficiency were very low. I think Tesla made one, not Tesla, Nikola Tesla, not any jackass running the Tesla corporate today, but Nikola Tesla created one of the more efficient energies, electric energies for his time for a dam, and even that was it wasn't highly. I mean, I don't know what the efficiency was, but I don't think it was more than 30 or 40% efficiency.
Yeah, I think the average internal combustion engine has somewhere between 20 and 30% efficiency, something like that. Because naturally, heat's going to be lost to the block. You got to overcome friction. I mean, you've got all this stuff that you lose energy to. That's
sure.
Thomas Massey, like my representative, the one that's been fighting for here from the United States. Leo probably knows Thomas Massey.
Mm-hmm.
He actually his entire house. He's got this house. He built his entire house runs on an original Tesla battery. Like that's something I found was pretty interesting. He's like off the grid, sort of.
Yeah, I'm assuming he probably has like solar power system or something like that.
Yeah. I don't know how all that works, but like it was like a really old Tesla battery that he uses. Like he's got a video on it. I thought it was pretty cool because the only time I ever hear the word Tesla is with like the flat Earth community and stuff. They like to throw that name around a lot.
They like to throw a lot of names around, and it's always the names of dead guys.
Yeah,
from like 100+ years ago. It's really funny.
It's the best names to throw around, man. The dead guys. But Darklight, what's up, man? You're back.
Yeah, sorry, I was driving. I couldn't really hear very well earlier, so I couldn't participate too well. I had a couple points for Leo. First off, I'm pretty impressed with you, Leo. Do you got your own channel?
I do, yes.
Okay,
should be.
Okay, I'll check it out and subscribe to you. Yeah, you've impressed me so far. So I'm a non-Abrahamic true monotheist. I believe in imaginary friends, and you can't stop me. And
there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, shit.
Yeah. Well, I would like to respond to a statement you made earlier where you said that you can absolutely say that God is not true. And for me, what that comes down to is it depends on how you define God. Because I define God very different from how most theists define God. So essentially, I say that we are all God. So I am God and I exist. Therefore, God exists. Now, of course, when I say that, most people automatically attribute the exact same traits that they think that the Abrahamic gods have, which is omnipotent, all-knowing, which they claim that, right? But we all know that they aren't actually that, as is clearly seen in the scriptures. But so I don't propose any of those for my definition of God. God cannot be all-powerful because God cannot be all-knowing. God cannot be all-present. So I don't say God is any of those things. So usually when I say I am God, I'll have Christians come at me and say stuff like, "Oh yeah, well, are you all powerful?" It's like, no, I'm not, but neither is your fucking God. They like to claim that their God is all powerful, but he has proven himself to not be all powerful. So the way I like to say it is, the one true creator called on me to defy the broken theology of Abraham everywhere that I encounter it. The one true creator is very disappointed in how the followers of Abraham have been portraying him and and misportraying him for the most part. So I know a lot of other people are, familiar with me. I just wanted to show you some of my beliefs right there. And so I am God, therefore God exists, is my thing. When you say there is no God whatsoever, I am God. So I definitely exist. I am God. But it's not just me. We're all God. You're God. Robert's God. Robin's God. We're all God. Because to
I'm
me,
not God. I'm grade 8.
all consciousness is an extension of the omni-consciousness, as I like to say it. We are all co-creators within the Godhood.
I'm grade 8.
Yeah, that sounds like some sort of could be some sort of panentheism or pantheism rather, or perhaps some sort of idealism. I mean, I could even be some sort of idealist pantheism, which, I mean, to me, pantheism I think is quite consistent with an idealist view, depending on how one cashes out pantheism.
Well, yeah, I'm creating my own theology, which I do have parallels to existing theologies out there, but I don't claim any existing theology out there.
No, nothing wrong with that.
Actually, I'm writing some books, and I would love to have smart people like you to send some of the books to when I get done with them for criticisms, for notes and stuff, and for reviews, because I'm going to need reviews when I go to publish my books.
Right on.
Yeah, it's an interesting perspective. You get perspectives to the degree that they're not affecting school systems, I would say. For me, to the degree that they're not affecting autonomy and whatnot, there's some of these things that they're just beyond epistemology. When we're talking about like even models of idealism, what if idealism is true? How would anything in the world change? For me, it doesn't seem that it would make any distinguishment. It seems like what you do with this almost, again, I tend to lean towards identifying it as a pantheistic kind of set, but however you want to define it, it doesn't seem to me that it would change the definition of universe. You could just say the universe is, and all it's doing is giving reverence to. It's now making more recognition of reverence outside of it adding more reverence to the universe. What does it do? What is the view doing outside of that? Is there any functionality of the view to distinguish it different from the universe is, to say that God is?
Well, I think the distinguishment is in how you perceive yourself, because once you realize that you are God and that you create your own universe, I think there's a great utility to that. As opposed to saying, you are just an observer of the universe. You are an intrinsic mover of the universe. Therein lies the distinguishment for me, is in your perception of that. So I think there definitely has a great utility in realizing that you are God, because once you realize that you are God and that you
hold on though. You're saying there's a great utility in recognizing that in terms of like your behaviors or your attitudes towards, is that what you're saying? Like if you hold that X is true, is that this is changing your attitudes towards, and that the attitudes are a benefit? Or is there anything intrinsically inside of the belief that is beneficial that is not about the attitudes? The reason that I mention this is because many different religions hold certain things to be true, that their attitudes towards it can be beneficial, but the belief itself, there's nothing intrinsic about the belief. It's just that the belief creates attitudes and predispositions towards and respects towards certain things, that is what is changing, the outcome. So
I think that's that. Yeah, I would say the attitudes, but it's not just attitudes. It's your entire perception, So yeah.
But I would say that, like you said, create my own universe. I don't feel like that I create my own universe. I believe I may have my own perception of my universe that I live in. Like every person and every probably living animal probably has its own perception of it. But I feel like they share one common universe. Like as far as I know.
I'm gonna let you get your dog. I'm gonna pull you off the stage for just a minute there, Dark Light. Yeah, I think it's been very interesting.
Thank you.
No
I'm
last
gonna jump
minute
up here.
questions here. We're going to wrap. I'm gonna get the link is posted. Also, I wanted to mention Robin. I'm going to put a link here for Darklight. As soon as Darklight settled here, I'm going to just let him say his last words, and we're going to do a roundabout. Robin, did you have any last words on the subjects and your thoughts about the subjects today?
No, I appreciate Leo coming on. I always learn something when I listen to Leo. I don't always understand everything he says, but I try to add a little bit to it. Like I've been watching him for quite a while on like Mark Reed's channel and stuff, and he used to do a lot of the debates. Are you going to go back to debating anytime soon?
Actually, yeah, I have a debate next Saturday on the Thought Experiment, which is Wes's new channel over from the Skeptic Haven. I'm going to be debating a friend of mine, David Pullman, who I know well, who I've debated before. We're going to be debating physicalism versus substance dualism.
Yeah. I would like to invite you to. I don't know if you've ever heard of Painburn.
Pangburn, yeah, I have. I would be great to be on Pangburn. They're
Yes.
freaking huge.
I am in tight with Painburn. Like he paid for me to go to several conventions this year, and I'm over there all the time. And I'll post a Discord link in chat if you want to. We have a really good community over there, like for philosophy and science discussion.
Oh, you should tell him if he's looking for somebody to do debates related to things in like science and philosophy of science and God's existence. I'm somebody he can absolutely get hold of.
Yes.
I can certainly provide for entertaining debates.
Like Travis actually appears in Discord a lot himself. So like I've gotten to know him personally, and I used to watch all their debates all the time. So it was almost like meeting a famous person, kind of. And I'll post the Discord link too if anybody wants to join. But I'm Robin Webster, and I do debates. But I'm just trying to help out, like get some people like Skeptic Philosophy and a few others, their channels built up.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Robin. You've done some good plugging for me, and I do appreciate it. That having been said, we're going to start closing you down, and we're going to get the last words from the rest. Robin, I'm going to pull you off a stage, but
Yes,
if you want to hang tight, I'll chat to you after we're done closing up here.
Okay.
Darklight, your thoughts on everything?
I also have a podcast, and I would like to have an open invitation to you, Robert, and you, Leo, to come on my podcast. I'm trying to get a good lineup going. I don't have them super consistently. I go for quality over quantity. And I got a really hard time getting followers of Abraham because I'm very critical of them, and I'm openly critical of them. And as soon as I start telling them my criticisms, all of a sudden, whoever was volunteering to come on my podcast starts dropping out. Because I don't like to ambush anyone. You know, I like them to know my position and to have counter arguments built up for my positions. And as soon as I start doing that, the followers of Abraham start dropping out of willingness to participate in my podcast. So far, I have the atheists have been the most willing to interact with me. You know, and I take that as a sign of confidence. You know, if you are confident in your position, then you will not mind talking about your position on any platform. So I would definitely like to have both you, Robert, and you, Leo, come out, because what's taking me so long is I'm trying to get followers of Abraham, but once again, I'm just going to have to go on without them, because I've had about 5 or 6 episodes so far, and I've gotten, spiritual people, I've gotten atheists, and the only followers of Abraham that I've been able to get so far is a Gnostic Christian, which to me, those are the most tolerable Christians. So if I might be reaching out to you guys to see if you want to participate, and I'll set up scheduling. I'll work around everyone's scheduling, because to me it's more about quality over quantity. But I have a nice list of all kinds of different topics wrote up from my content itinerary that I can forward to you.
Yeah, by all means. I don't know if you've ever got me on Discord, but put me on Discord, man. I'm Raven5238 on Discord. I've been having some problems with Discord, so I apologize if y'all have been blocked. I thought it was resolved, but it hasn't been. Yeah, I think I'm going to have to delete the account.
Do you have a Discord link in your under the video?
When we come off stage, or when we come off live stream, I'll get some information to you.
Okay.
That having been said, though, you're good. We're going to pull you up and let Leo have his last word here. Appreciate it, man.
Yep.
Leo? So yeah, like I mentioned, I have that debate next Saturday. That'll be at 2 p.m. Central Time. On the channel is called The Thought Experiment. It's not a huge channel, so you might have to type The Thought Experiment channel, and it should come up. If you know who Wes is from Skeptic Haven, it's his new debate channel. That's going to be with David Paulman on physicalism versus substance dualism. So David's fun to chat with. He's an extremely intelligent individual and makes for very, very good discussion. So that'll definitely be a substantive discussion to watch if that's what you're into. Other than that, like I said, I'm going to try to get some stuff out on some Jay Dyer dumbassery on my channel within the next week or so, hopefully. And then within the next few weeks, I hope to get some debates posted that I've had once I get this editing stuff figured out.
Fantastic. Hey, I did want to mention, Wes has reached out to me. I knew about the channel weeks ago. He was going to be getting it launched off. I was trying to get a debate set up myself there. Unfortunately, the gentleman that I wanted to debate, which was Jill, actually doesn't want to do the on-camera thing. But I might get another gentleman set up with the debate on the Trinity. I'm kind of interested in debating somebody on the subject of the Trinity. But it's a great channel, and they are running in this time slot. So there's actually a debate going on presently that you can go over there. Links in the description now. It is pinned, and this is where Leo's fixing to be at for his debate. I'm coming out of this time frame very shortly. We're by the end of the month. I'm fixing to be done with this time frame. We're going to Sunday, but our next guest, which is going to be next week, this coming Saturday, is actually going to be Miss Claire Call. She has a position of secular Quranism. Yes,
Are you
I do.
familiar with it? Okay.
Yes,
yeah, just making sure.
I know we're oppositional. Our conversation is going to be a little more oppositional here, but we can all remain friendly. But yes, we'll be talking to Claire Call next Saturday, and a lot of people have actually been anticipating this one because I came in fairly hot with some criticism on her own objective ethics. So I obviously am quite critical of her position, but we're still going to have a chit chat and remain peaceable next Saturday. After that, the following Saturday, actually not Saturday, we've now moved Kurt to Sunday. The following Sunday, we're fixing to go ahead and move to Sundays. He's going to be talking about the book of Mark. But that having been said, I appreciate it. I encourage everyone to remain skeptical and